Okay, U.S. History 1, back again. Okay, this will be the last lecture I do leading into the lecture I already posted on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so that lecture actually should be following this one if you want to watch them in order. If not, no big deal. You can watch, if you've already watched it. You'll just kind of know what I'm going to say before I say it. All right, so creating a common Anglo-American culture. So the preceding videos looked at the different colonial region, England's colonies in North America, and how different they are. And they're really different, right? They have some similarities, but they have just as many differences as well. We'll see how that shapes the debate about the future of the country during and after the American Revolution. When they declared independence in 1776, they used the term "these United States of America, united in their purpose of gaining independence." The term state at the time, I think I referred to the Treaty of Westphalia briefly in one of my earlier lectures or other lectures. The concept of the state coming out of the religious wars of the 1600s and the Treaty of Westphalia, the sovereign state was an independent state, an independent country equal to other countries, that all countries, no matter how big or small, are legally equal. This kind of idea that comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the term "these United States," he was talking about 13 independent countries. And initially, the idea was that they were united in order to gain their independence, but after the Revolution, they'd be 13 independent countries. And even during the Revolution, they maintained a lot of independence. Ultimately, we're going to see after the midterm and after the Revolution, we'll see how this experiment at 13 independent countries fails. But initially, that's the idea. They're so friggin' different. Which begs the question, how would they ever unite to gain their independence and ultimately unite to form a single country? I'm going to start addressing that question in this lecture. Hopefully, I can keep this to about 30 to 45 minutes. That's going to be kind of my goal before we get into the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. All right, so one thing, Anglo-American. Anglo, from English. English is actually from the term Anglo, or Angle, going all the way back to the Germanic migrants or invaders, depending on your historical interpretation of events, back in the 400s and 500s with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and that migration period in which Germanic tribes spread throughout Western Europe. So one of those tribes, the Angles, the other one, the Saxons, also the Jutes and Frisians, settled in what's now England. England, the land of the Angles. Anglo-Saxon is really a compound of Angle and Saxon. So Anglo, in one usage, refers to somebody of English ancestry. And there's been a lot of new history, archaeology, and genetics kind of questioning and redefining the whole migration era in Angles and Saxon in England in the 400s and 500s. So that's a huge can of friggin' worms in terms of ancestry. Maybe I'll post an article on that if you're interested. And throughout much of U.S. history and English history in the 19th and 20th century, Anglo-Saxon was often used as kind of an ethnic or racial term to describe somebody who is of English ancestry. Another way to use it, though, much more common, particularly in textbooks like the one we have, is in terms of language and culture. The most common language in the United States is English. So when I use the term Anglo-American, I'm not talking about people of English ancestry. I'm talking about the language and culture borrowed from England. So keep in mind, majority of the colonists in the Americas are not of English ancestry. Only about 42% by 1775, the beginning of the American Revolution, only about 42% of the population in the colonies was of English ancestry. The next biggest group, about 20%, were of African ancestry. Other groups, though, the Welsh were about 7.8%. The Scotch-Irish were about 7.8%. Irish, I think, were about 6%. I've got a whole little, I've got a slide in one of my PowerPoints. We'll look at that later. But even though people of English ancestry or English birth are a minority in the colonies, they are the single largest minority. And as a result, that's going to play a role in this process of Anglicization. This is the first thing we're going to look at in terms of the process of becoming English or Anglo. Again, looking at it in terms of language and culture, not birth. This is not, some racial identity. This is a ethnic identity based on language and culture. So the process of adopting this culture, it's a process of acculturation. If you take sociology, your teacher will talk about the process of acculturation, the process of adopting a new culture or developing a new culture. So obviously then, so roughly 42%. 42% English ancestry. So they're the largest minority. Everybody's a minority. There is no majority population. But they're the single largest minority. So what language then is going to become the most dominant, right? English. But also, colonial charters and government. Remember, all of the colonies were established by contracts, charters with the English government. And the governments themselves, to the extent that there is a colonial bureaucracy, they're going to be English officials or local officials, mostly of English ancestry. So the language of the government is going to be English. So the United States today, we don't have an official language in the United States, but if you go to the county courthouse or the federal unemployment office, federal courts, everyone's going to be speaking English. You can get an interpreter for Spanish or Vietnamese, but the dominant language is English. So from the beginning of the colonial period, this is going to be a pattern that persists today. So if you want to do business, want to go to court, want to petition the local government, you need to know English, because they didn't have interpreters for non-English speakers back then. Also, though, the printing press. There are going to be some foreign language newspapers published, for example, in the Philadelphia area, well into the, I'm not sure if there's any now, but I know that well into the 20th century, there were some newspapers published in Welsh. So there are going to be some printing presses that continue to maintain the language of the immigrant communities. But by and large, the press is going to be in English. Benjamin Franklin, right? Benjamin Franklin, his day job is printing. So most of the newspapers and publications are going to be in English. Another thing, not just law though, not just language, is English common law. This is something we use to, our legal system is still based on today, which is made up of two different features. Statutes, so law codes, the other, though, is precedent or case law. This goes all the way back to even before the Anglo-Saxon migrations into England. A common feature of both Celtic tribes and Germanic tribes, apart from the Roman tradition, was you didn't, not a statute law, not a written law code. So in the Germanic and Celtic traditions, without a writing system, the legal system, kind of tribal legal system, was based on case law, legal precedent. What had similar, or what had previous kings or chieftains or judges decided in similar cases? What had your dad decided when he was the chief of the community? So what developed in England after the Anglo-Saxon migrations is going to be this kind of tribal legal system. The Norman conquest in 1066, Francophile Vikings, or descendants of Vikings and Rollo, who had settled in the Seine River Valley and whose ancestors conquered the coastline of northern France to form Normandy. 1066, Rollo's grandson, William the Bastard, conquered England, got the much more appealing name William the Conqueror, and imposed a Roman-inspired legal system. The French, under Charlemagne, creator of the Holy Roman Empire, had adopted a Roman-inspired legal code, the Justinian Code, as a standard law code in the Holy Roman Empire. So the Normans, Francophile descendants of Vikings, bring a Roman-inspired legal code to impose on England. However, the majority of the population, though, was used to this earlier tribal system, and so what's going to develop is a hybrid. They'll have a legal code, but they're going to interpret that legal code through precedent. What have other judges ruled in similar cases? And this is going to set the English legal system apart from any other legal system in the world. The United States, India, Australia, Canada, so former English colonial regions all have the English common law, but aside from the areas of the former English Empire, everybody else uses a law code or a law system, largely based on the Napoleonic Code, which I'll talk about later, coming out of the French Revolution, which is a revision of the old Roman legal codes that had really kind of governed Europe for thousands of years. So the English system is completely different. And because the government system in the colonies is going to be based on these colonial charters, they use the English common law system. So even if you're a German immigrant or a Scotch-Irish immigrant or an African slave petitioning for your freedom, or who buys your freedom and then files suit in the legal system, you're going to be using the English common law. So even though 68% of the population, or excuse me, 58% of the population is non-English ancestry, they're all going to use the English common law system, what's now called the Anglo-American common law system. So that's going to create a common sense of culture and language as well. So the printing press, literature, legal system, the language everybody uses, and also trade and commerce. Again, if you're doing business, and remember in the 1700s, there's increasing trade and commerce between the colonies. All of that business is going to be done within the context of the English common law system, and the contracts are all going to be written in English. So again, regardless of what your ancestry may be or what your language that you learned growing up as a kid, everything's going to be, your business dealings are going to be predominantly in English. And increasingly, this is also going to shape material culture. The Navigation Acts are going to be really significant. Starting in the 1650s, during the rule of Lord Oliver Cromwell, the English increasingly saw the Dutch as competitors, not as allies. So the first of these Navigation Acts was passed in the 1650s to try to ensure that England benefited from trade with its colonies in the Americas and elsewhere. I should just say its colonies, because these Navigation Acts, the textbooks, talk about these with regards to England's colonies in North America. They also apply to England's colonies in the Caribbean, Barbados, later Jamaica, but also its colonies in India and in Africa. The idea So the goal, this is what your authors describe as mercantilism, which is very different from capitalism. Mercantilism sees wealth as a zero-sum equation. There's only so much wealth in the world. It's like a pizza. Once you've baked the pizza, that's it. So if I want more slices of pizza, you're going to get less. So they see wealth then, these Navigation Acts are inspired by the idea of mercantilism. there's only so much wealth. And for England then to benefit from the wealth of its colonies, only England should be able to trade with its colonies. So enumerated goods, so lists goods that are on a numbered list. They have a numbered list of stuff. And what's going to change throughout the colonial period from the first Navigation Act in the 1650s is going to be revisions to the Navigation Acts from the 1650s up through the 1750s. So for 100 years, England is going to tinker with these by just adding new stuff to the list. So enumerated goods, so stuff that is on a numbered list. They need to go through an English port. So if it's or made in England. Hold on. So goods from the colonies need to be shipped through English ports. Remember, the English government is relatively small and poor. What is the most efficient way to collect taxes on trade? Because remember, that's how governments make money, is by taxes. So if the English government wants to control trade and make money on trade, what's the most efficient way to collect goods on taxes? Sending English tax collectors to an empire that spans the globe, or requiring all of the goods on the list to go to an English port, a port in England, and have a tax collector in England collect the taxes. That's right. It's going to be it's going to be from collecting taxes in England. So this is kind of a way, and kind of logistical way, to simplify collecting taxes on trade. So tobacco from Virginia, that's going to be one of the first things that's put on the list in the 1650s, because the English government was worried that Dutch merchants in New Netherlands, in New Amsterdam, what's now New York City, were sailing down the coast of Virginia, buying tobacco in Virginia and selling it back in Holland. Therefore, the Dutch government was collecting tax revenue on tobacco from Virginia that they thought the English government should be collecting. So how do you make sure the English government is the only one who benefits on tobacco from Virginia? Require that tobacco from Virginia get imported into England before it can be sold anywhere else. From there, it can be sold to Holland, France, Germany, German states, Italy, wherever. But if the government's going to collect taxes on it, they're going to collect it in England rather than when it leaves Virginia, because that would require a much larger bureaucracy. Manufactured goods. This is really going to be implemented in the 1690s. So starting in the 1690s, they start adding manufactured goods to the list. So manufactured goods, cloth, hats, pins, like pins like you use for sewing, glass, need to come from England. Sometime and later, by the 1760s, this included printed material. If you're going to import books into the colonies, they have to be printed in England. And again, that means that it's going to be all in English. So manufactured goods need to come from England. This is to protect English manufacturers. This is at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So if you want to grow the English economy, manufacturing in England, you one way to do so is by prohibiting manufactured goods from other countries being imported into your colonies. Increasingly from the 1690s onwards, all of the manufactured goods that you can purchase in New England, the Middle Colonies, the Chesapeake, the Low Countries, are all going to come from England, including printed material, books, like pattern books for making clothes. People often bought, the most common way people made their clothes was to buy cloth from a store, a pattern book for how to sew that into the latest fashions, and then sew your own clothes at home. There were, only the richest people could buy clothes off the rack and have it fitted at a tailor. The vast majority of people buy cloth and sew their own clothes at home. I don't know if any of y'all's parents did that, but when I was growing up, my parents didn't have a whole lot of money. Most of my clothes, my mom made. At least all my shirts. I didn't have very many store-bought clothes. Most of my clothes when I was a little kid was stuff my mom made by buying cloth from a store and sewing it at home, staying up late sewing clothes. So that means that because all the pattern books are going to come from England, that all the clothes people wear are in English fashion, which shapes people's attitudes, like at a subconscious level. If everybody dresses the same as you, it kind of creates a sense of homogeneity. So if you're traveling, so trade and commerce, if you're traveling between the colonies, if you're a New England merchant, you go to Charlestown in South Carolina, everybody there is going to be dressed the same as you. They may have a different accent, but they all speak English, but they're all dressed the same as you. And you're dressed the same as them, so they don't see you right away as an outsider or a foreigner. You're dressed the same. And the buildings are all going to be the same. Because the pattern books for building architecture, for designing buildings, are all going to be printed in England. So colonial architecture is all going to resemble English architecture. New England itself benefits from this. Because one of the features of the Navigation Acts, ships, is that all of these goods need to be transported on English ships with a majority of English crews. And under the laws of the British Empire, the colonial subjects were legally speaking English, whether they were of Scotch-Irish ancestry, German ancestry, whatever. If they're born in the colonies, they're Englishmen. So under the Navigation Acts then, ships that are built in New England and crewed by New Englanders are English. New England merchants are still able to engage in trade and commerce with all of the colonies, not only in North America, but in Barbados and English slave trading ports in Africa, because they're English ships. New English merchants then grumble about this initially, but ultimately they're going to benefit from this because this means that they don't have to compete with Dutch or Spanish or French merchants because Dutch and Spanish and French merchants are prohibited from doing business in any of the colonial ports. So this is in effect going to give New England merchants a near monopoly on the trade in the colonies. And that's going to lead to economic growth in New England, and really the explosion of the shipbuilding industry in New England as well. Even if the ship is owned by merchants in England, it's cheaper to build the ships in New England and own it if you're a merchant in England than to have the raw timber shipped back to England and then build the ship in England. This is going to stimulate the shipbuilding industry in New England, and it's going to lead to the growth of wealth amongst New England merchants. All right, so that talks about this process of Anglicization. All right, another thing, wars. Let me check the time real quick, see if I need to do a separate one. Yep, I'm going to do this as a separate one and finish up this topic or subtopic on Anglicization. We'll look at the wars because nothing kind of brings people together like the threat of a common enemy. And we'll see increasingly in the 1600s and 1700s, England's wars in Europe is going to drag the colonies into their wars, and that's going to create a common sense of identity as well. So I'll talk about that next.